Hello and welcome to another episode of Peace at Last, the podcast that discusses the latest scientific discoveries in psychology, explains techniques and principles from ancient spiritual traditions, and gives you the mental technology to put them into practice. You can change the way you feel and find peace at last. My name is Fabrice Nye, psychologist, coach, and spiritual explorer. If this podcast speaks to you, you may subscribe on the platform of your choice. I also invite you to share your favorite episode with some of your friends. Word of mouth is the best way to spread the word and support the podcast. You are listening to episode number 7, and for those of you listening to this in the future, we are still in the throes of the coronavirus pandemic. But for those of you listening in real time, I'm sure you are getting sick of hearing the news about the pandemic or advice on what to do for your health, mental or physical. So as of now, I'm declaring this podcast a virus-free zone. You may always get your COVID-19 information elsewhere. Now that this is out of the way, I would like to take a little bit of a left turn today and share my view of spirituality. And in that process, to share a little bit about myself and my path. But before we do this, I'd like to thank Julian Raichle for leaving a comment in the show notes for episode 3. He wrote, "Dear Fabrice, congratulations on your new podcast. I heard about it on that one episode of the Feeling Good podcast where you announced it. I remember you mentioned that you plan to have also a French version of it, and I wonder if you've decided on when that will be. Anyway, congratulations again, and keep up the good work. It's very interesting." Well, thank you, Julian. To answer your question, you're right. I do intend to create a French version of this podcast. I even have a name for it. However, I will wait a few months before I do so for when I feel like I have a good sense of where this one is going, and when I feel I have the rhythm of creating the episodes under control. At this point, I don't think I have the bandwidth to create 2 separate episodes per week. I appreciate your question, though, and I encourage anyone else to leave questions and comments in the show notes. Email me at fabrice@life.net or leave reviews on Apple iTunes. I have also received a report of the recordings having an echo and the sounds being tinny. I'm wondering whether this is a generalized situation and whether I need to look into upgrading my setup. So let me know. I have made a brief mention of what I mean by spirituality in my episode of introduction, episode 0. In there, I cited Sam Harris's book, Waking Up, where he writes, "The feeling that we call I is an illusion. There's no discrete self or ego. Deepening that understanding of the way things are and repeatedly cutting through the illusion of the self is the meaning of spirituality." I had been ambivalent about Sam Harris because of his self-avowed atheism. It seemed to be at odds with his long-time meditation practice, his multiple meditation retreats, and his development of a meditation app. That was until I heard him define what he meant by that in a conversation with Scott Galloway. And he said this about atheism.
It doesn't exclude anything that people have traditionally done to connect deeply with the world or their own deepest possibility of positive emotional experience. I mean, so like all the beauty and awe and self-inquiry and even mysticism. I mean, atheism really is only a denial that any of our ancient books were written by the creator of the universe. The moment you oppose the claims about the books, well, then you're functionally an atheist, certainly with respect to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But you haven't closed the door to anything else. I mean, in terms of the experiential side of, what happens to a human mind when you go into a cave for 10 years and do nothing but meditate or take psychedelics or perturb the nervous system in any other way. There's a lot to be said about what happens. You just don't have to pretend to know anything on insufficient evidence in order to say it.
According to that definition, then, yes, I am an atheist. Perhaps because I am a scientist at heart, but I have long had a deep interest in exploring the farthest reaches of the human psyche with no preconceived idea of what is possible and what isn't. In that respect, I am not a materialist. A materialist is someone who posits the axiom that all that exists necessarily originates from matter. Such a view would uphold that psychology can be reduced to biology, biology to chemistry, and chemistry to physics. But these ideas do not constitute scientific knowledge. Rather, they represent as much a metaphysical position as the view that an organizing intelligence created and controls reality. These are not my words, but they are quoted from the Dalai Lama. So it's a philosophical, not a scientific position to argue that matter is all there is. It might be true, but then again, it might not. There are enough serious dissenting voices on the topic that I'm willing to consider that consciousness may not originate from matter, but either be a separate principle, like you would say electricity or the law of gravity, or even be primary, with matter being itself an emanation of consciousness. I began my path toward this notion when I was a child in the 70s, perusing my mother's library, which was rife with books on esotericism, psychic phenomena, and psychoanalysis. One of those captured my attention. At the time, I didn't really know why. It was called Ashrams, and it had been written in 1961 by French filmmaker Arnaud Desjardins, who had specialized in creating documentaries on Eastern spiritual traditions. In that book, he told the story of 4 major spiritual figures of India: Swami Shivananda Saraswati, Anandamayi Ma, Ramana Maharshi, and Swami Ramdas. That's not the American Ramdas, formerly known as Richard Alpert, whom I will also talk about. And so that book opened my mind to the possibility that there was something out there to be known that was beyond what our mind can understand. In that book, Desjardins wrote, "The essential, fundamental reality of the universe, and in particular of the human being, is absolutely different from what happens to the senses, from what we know about it, and from what we take to be real." Somehow the message resonated with me. I spent a good part of my life seeking for that reality with a capital R. It seemed to me that some people had access to it at a very deep level, that it represented the essence of our humanness, and that my life would be lacking in meaning if I spent it without ever knowing who I really am. That pursuit took a back seat in my youth to surviving high school, college, and trying to get started in my professional life. But in my early 30s, I started to remember that I had left behind a part of me. What helped me reawaken my quest came in the form of a 5-cassette tape program called Spiritual Awakening, produced by Nightingale Conant. It was a compilation of some of Ramdas's best teaching moments, collated from workshops he had been giving around the country. For those of you who don't know Ramdas, he was a professor of psychology at Harvard, working with Timothy Leary, who advocated widespread use of psychedelics in the United States of the 1960s. Ramdas, who was then known as Richard Alpert, went on to travel to India where he met his guru, Neem Karoli Baba. That's where he discovered that the type of experiences he had been having using psychedelics were available to human beings on a more stable basis rather than as a simple glimpse. Ramdas is an amazing raconteur. He used to say that that was the meaning of his name, R-A-M, for rant a mouth, that it was his mission to tell the stories that he had gleaned while in the company of many wise people. He inspired me to start meditating, which turned out to be a rather frustrating affair for me. I had a lot of trouble avoiding to get lost in thought, as most people who begin meditation are. At the time, I wanted to go find myself a guru. I went to India and actually found Western gurus, but I wasn't really swept off my feet. I discovered that it was not even necessary to go all the way to India. There were plenty of teachers available right here in California, but I never really clicked with any of them until I found somebody named Byron Katie. That was a turning point in my search. From her, I learned that my stress came from believing my untrue thoughts. Does that sound familiar? Hint, hint. Untrue thoughts contain thinking traps. Byron Katie seemed to have had the same kind of awakening that I had read about and heard about without having ever asked for it. She didn't even know about spirituality when she had her awakening. At the time, she was living in the high desert town of Barstow, California, and she had been in a 10-year descending spiral of depression, overeating, agoraphobia, self-loathing, addiction to painkillers, and just pure rage. Her children were so afraid of her that they would tiptoe past her bedroom, which she rarely left, because they were afraid that she would lash out at them. She was trading in real estate at the time and was doing all her transactions by phone. She would only reluctantly go out. She once said in a workshop that she had started buying the houses that surrounded hers to protect herself from her neighbors. She was convinced that if only she lost weight, she would feel better about herself. She checked into a home for women with eating disorders. That was something her insurance would pay for. And one day she woke up in that place and the Katie that she knew was gone. In fact, she no longer saw herself as Katie. All she knew was that it was looking through Katie's eyes, whatever that it was, and she was it. In that instant, she also noticed a thought arising, and something in her asking about that thought. Is it true? And she right away saw that it wasn't true in the state that she was in, and neither were any of the thoughts that she ever had. That was an immense liberation for her. That was when the method she calls the work was born. It starts with that question, is it true? And proceeds to undo all the stressful thoughts that make us miserable, the thoughts that argue with what is. When she came down from her room that morning, she was a changed person. In fact, she no longer was a person as she understood it. She had let go of absolutely everything she knew. This episode is beautifully described in the book she wrote with her husband, Stephen Mitchell, A Mind at Home with Itself. What is particularly exceptional to me is that all her misery had also evaporated in the process. If that was what enlightenment was like, it seemed not only to reveal to you your true nature, but in the process, it seemed to cure you of your distress. It appeared to be a relief both to psychological and existential anguish. This felt more and more attractive to me. Yet, what I had to realize, and I don't think I have yet, is that the ego is who wants that awakening. But that awakening is the ultimate letting go of the ego. Now, what do I mean by ego? This term is often equated with grandiosity, narcissism, and thinking highly of oneself. But that's not the type of ego I'm referring to, although that can be part of it. Ego is a Latin term that means I. It was a translation into English over a century ago of Sigmund Freud's German term Ich. For some reason, it sounded better to English speakers than using the pronoun I or even the word self. This psychoanalytic term is also slightly different from the spiritual concept. The meaning I want to ascribe to that word is that of self-concept. Ego is the sense of being an individual, an entity with characteristics, with a memory. It crystallizes around a name, personality, a story. We tack onto it all sorts of things that start with the word, I'm the kind of person who, and then fill in the blank. Maybe I'm the kind of person who does not like spinach, who votes Republican, who does not tolerate injustice, who sleeps through the night, who likes people, who blushes when speaking in public. In fact, the word person is an interesting word. In Latin, the word was persona. It is composed of the verb sonare, which means to sound, with the preposition per, which means through. In other words, persona means to sound through. Sound through what? Well, according to Alan Watts in the old Greco-Roman theater, actors used to wear a mask representing their character and outfit it with a mouthpiece that would project their voice into the theater, kind of like a megaphone. So the irony here is that the word person or personality actually refers to the mask you are wearing, implying that the real you is not that. The real you is what's behind the mask, behind the ego. So in the rest of this program and in future episodes, what I will call ego is that sense of self, that sense of being a Fabrice. Even if when I awake to what I really am, there really isn't such a thing as a Fabrice. Now, let's be clear about this. I'm not saying that there isn't a body or that particular labels have not been attached to that body, but all that is constructed. It's made up. The name Fabrice was invented someday by someone, and my mother told the recorder at the city hall that that name was to be associated with that body. Later, it got printed on an ID card, a driver's license, a passport. All that is made up. All my life I've been told, you're Fabrice. And I have believed it. I still do. But there's no such thing. There may be a sense of Fabrice, and there are certain actions that take place through a series of patterns associated with that sense. If Fabrice is anything, it is a verb, not a noun. Many people who have practiced certain kinds of meditation will report that when they look for a self, they are unable to find one. For most of us raised in the Western culture, we tend to locate our sense of self somewhere an inch or two behind the eyes, like a homunculus, a little character, driving the mind-body machine from there. But if there's a homunculus, who is driving the homunculus? I've had a few fleeting glimpses of that absence of self through the use of psychedelic substances or through some spiritual teachings, but nothing that I can rely on in my day-to-day life. I still get worried when my retirement account goes down with the stock market. I still get sad when I'm being excluded from a friend's gathering. So now, how do I know that what I'm talking about has any reality? After all, I can only point to a few glimpses that occurred under suspicious, altered state of mind, and I could be completely deluded. But just like I can't speak of quantum physics from personal experience, and for that I have to rely on the explanation given by high-level physicists, so too I rely on discoveries made by countless mystics, which have an uncanny way of sounding very much similar, no matter what culture or religion those mystics come from. What Byron Katie, for instance, reports about her experience is in complete alignment with the ancient text of the Tao Te Ching, or with the Hindu Upanishads, or with the teachings of the Buddha, or the writings of German theologian Meister Eckhart, as well as the Indian gurus talked about in the book Ashrams that I mentioned earlier. Those reports are in fact so consistent, in spite of the different cultural origins, that it has been said that there exists a perennial philosophy that underlies all spiritual traditions. This is not a new idea. It was already discussed during the Renaissance. It was brought to our consciousness in modern times by Aldous Huxley, who wrote a book by the same name, The Perennial Philosophy. The theory is that even if all culture was wiped out, over time the human race would rediscover mysticism, just like it would rediscover the law of gravity. The religious schools that come out of it might differ in their rituals, their myths, and their metaphysical beliefs, just like they do among all the many religions right now, but their origin would remain the same. The notion of a unitive principle that splinters into seemingly independent conscious entities. What is of interest to me here is not the metaphysics of it. If all it provided was a way to explain how the universe works, it would certainly be nice, but it would simply be a curiosity to me. What I find way more attractive has to do with the premise of this podcast. It is the fact that the direct experience of that understanding provides a doorway into the peace that does not depend on external circumstances, the peace that passeth all understanding. Now, awakening or enlightenment is not necessarily a guarantee of happiness. Even though Byron Katie and other people who have gone through this awakening and have somehow managed to incorporate that into their lives seem to be more immune or more resilient to the disturbances that afflict the rest of us, other supposedly enlightened masters are also reported to have troublesome emotional reactions or even outrageously unethical behavior. But to focus on the positive side effects of this phenomenon, it seems to be related to the seeing through of the sense of self. According to Buddhism, the belief in an inherent self is the source of suffering. This can be seen intuitively, but has found an echo more recently in the discovery of a set of brain structures called the default mode network. Those brain regions tend to light up under an fMRI scanner when the individual is daydreaming, mind-wandering, and more specifically thinking about themselves, thinking about others, remembering the past, and planning for the future. On the other hand, the default mode network tends to be much less active when the individual is performing a focused task, or as some refer to it, being in the zone. The default mode network, interestingly, is also less active when an experienced meditator is in a meditative state. Another situation that tends to quiet down the default mode network is taking psychedelics. In all of the above, when the sense of the self, the ego, takes a backseat or disappears, people report feeling better. Mental suffering such as depression, anxiety, stress, rage, panic, low self-esteem, worry, hopelessness begin to fade and temporarily go away with the shutting down of the ego. It is notable that all those mental conditions are improved by one particular factor. In my mind, and this is only an educated speculation, there may not be much difference between those various kinds of mental suffering. The DSM-5, the psychiatric manual that lists all the known mental disorders, lists no less than 157 different diagnoses. Yet, even though pharmaceutical companies like to develop specific drugs for each new diagnosis, making a hefty profit in the process, anyone who works with therapy clients will know that doctors tend to prescribe the same old medications for a wide variety of symptoms. Antidepressants are not only used strictly for depressant. Anxiolytics are not used only for anxiety disorders. Mood stabilizers are not just used for mania. To me, this is a hint that there's a common factor to all those troubles, and those drugs tend to target that factor, albeit partially and with lots of side effects, though. That factor, I contend, is exactly what the Buddha taught. The belief in an intrinsic self is at the root of dukkha, translated in English as suffering, or more accurately, unsatisfactoriness. So there you have it. My suffering originates from me mistaking me as a self. When I see through it, the suffering ceases, and seeing through it, seeing through the identification as a self, as a unit, as a Fabrice, is the meaning of spirituality. It is not easy after this expose to leave you with a practice you can readily use. In particular, if it were easy to see through our sense of self, we will all already be enlightened and there would be no point for this podcast. I could recommend that you find yourself a Buddhist teacher and go meditate for the next 30 years, but there's no guarantee of the outcome. I'm not sure how many of you would be willing to launch into that. I wouldn't. Where I could direct you is the Buddha's teaching on the 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates are the 5 aspects of what makes a person. Remember that we discovered that the root of this word person means a mask. For the Buddha, this mask is made of 5 things. 1, form, mainly the body. 2, sensations or feelings, which could be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This is kind of like the affect that we talked about in episode 3. 3rd, perceptions. Those are the interpretations we derive from our 5 senses. 4, mental formations, which in Buddhism refer to our conditioned responses to our perceptions. And 5, consciousness, i.e. the awareness of what we perceive. These notions are probably unfamiliar to you unless you are a Buddhist scholar. They certainly are to me. You may want to get a primer on these by reading the book by Robert Wright, Why Buddhism is True. But following Buddha's hints, we could agree that many of us, if not most, tend to identify ourselves with our thoughts most of the time, if not all of the time. So, are we our thoughts? Well, is there any permanence to our thoughts? The Buddha would ask. If you've been paying attention at all, the answer is clearly no. In fact, if they were part of our mythical self, would we not be in control of those thoughts? I mean, what does it mean to be a self if it's not in control of itself? So if you think that you are in control of your thinking, I have a very quick experiment to help debunk that myth. Sit in a meditative pose, whatever that means to you. Close your eyes. Focus on your breath. See how it feels when the air comes in and how it feels when the air goes out. If you are like me, or anyone else for that matter, in very short order, your attention will have drifted away from the breath. See, thoughts happen beyond our control. So if you have no control of where you direct your thinking, can you say that it is part of yourself? If you keep investigating the other aggregates, your body, your sensations, etc., you may be hard-pressed to find yourself anywhere. I'm still investigating myself. See, I'm still referring to myself. Hard to get away from that tenacious sense of self. So, in closing, I would recommend to any of you out there listening to this podcast, if you haven't sampled mindfulness meditation, give it a try. Expect to get frustrated, as I was, when you won't be able to remain in the observer's position and get lost in your train of thoughts. The number one goal of this kind of meditation is for you to realize that you've jumped on the train without noticing it, to notice it, and then to intentionally get off that train for the umpteenth time. Think of it as doing reps when you're weightlifting. The more often you bring your attention back, the better you will become at staying off the train of thoughts. So good luck with that. This concludes this episode of Peace at Last. For more information, go to peaceatlast.us, where you will find the show notes for this episode. If you have comments or questions, leave them on the website, or you can email me directly at fabrice@life.net. I may be selecting your question as a topic for a future episode. If you just discovered this podcast, I invite you to subscribe on iTunes or on the platform of your choice. If you like this podcast and you want to support it, tell a friend who may not be familiar with podcasting and show them how to subscribe. I also invite you to go to iTunes and leave a review. It will help other people discover this podcast. I am Dr. Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join me next time for another episode of Peace at Last.